Hi, this is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is on the 7 Years' War, which is a conflict fought really in many areas of the world. There's fighting in Europe, there's fighting in North America, there's fighting in the Caribbean, there's even fighting in far-off areas like India. And so, in some respects, the 7 Years' War, which was fought among quite a few European powers, the French and the British, the ones we will consider the most, as well as native elements, in some respects, it was a global war. The 7 Years' War had also a tremendous ramification for the American Revolution, and in some respects, it really established some key precedents for the development of the American Revolution. So, life in 18th century America. The first thing I want to do before we start talking about the lead up to the 7 Years' War is to talk a little bit about life in 18th century America. And you see here depicted the American colonies of North America by mid 18th century. Generally, towards the coast. Most of the populations would have been towards the coastal areas, and anywhere in the realm of the Appalachian Mountains was considered westward at that time, though people in the colonies were increasingly moving west in the middle of the 18th century over the Appalachian Mountains. So the colonies experienced a huge population growth from some 300,000 to 2.5 million. And this had huge implications. More people were coming to the colonies. The colonial trade was expanding. More people seeking avenues for profit. There's also the continued issue of expansion. As more people come to the colonies seeking land and opportunity, more people seek, like we saw in Bacon's Rebellion, to push further westward and use lands controlled by Native Americans, or in this case also controlled by the French colonial empire, which was establishing itself in the Ohio River Valley. And this westward movement will continually lead to increasing violence between colonialists, British colonialists, or I should say colonialists of the British Empire in the Americas, and French colonialists, as well as Native Americans in Western realms. And that cost the Crown a lot of money and is a critical factor ultimately in the development of the American Revolution. By and large, the demographic, meaning where people are living, it's a rural colony. Now, in the southern areas of the colony, like, for example, the Chesapeake, it's increasingly rural. People live largely on farms and plantation estates, and there's very poor road development. And usually the only people in places like the Chesapeake that could actually obtain an education would be people who lived on plantations whose parents or family had the money to hire a teacher, a tutor, to come in and teach their students on site. There's not nearly the type of town development in places like the Chesapeake during the 17th and the 18th century. By contrast, in the northern areas where you see the most formidable cities developing, cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and of course Charleston in South Carolina is developing largely as a slave port, but Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were really establishing themselves as the primary cities in the colonies. And New England, in part because of its geography, New England was generally organized around town life. And so people in New England tended to live closer together. And this facilitated the development of local small-level democracy and the so-called Massachusetts Bay Town Meeting, which was a kind of early example of early democracy in the country. So people tended to live closer together in New England, and you saw less in the way of large farming, though it wasn't completely absent in certain parts, depending on the area of the north you're thinking about. But generally, you see less large farming in the New England area, and more shipping and these types of things, and more towns close together. Generally, the country, or the colony, I should say, is rural. More people live in the countryside vastly than they do in the city. And actually, that doesn't change in the United States until the 1920s. It's not until the early 20th century where more Americans were living in cities than they were in the countryside. And your cities of the 18th century are what you call walking cities. They are smaller cities that are traversable by an individual on foot, and of course they're pre-industrial cities. So, in some cases as well, cities have issues with garbage and waste and so forth. And many of the cities too, in some cases, would have had, pigs, for example, roaming the streets of the cities. In some of the towns and cities of the 18th century, the pig was sort of like a natural garbage disposal. The country, or the colony, was becoming increasingly diverse as well by the 18th century. We had the migration of Pennsylvania immigrants who were wrongly labeled the Pennsylvania Dutch, when in fact they were German immigrants moving to Pennsylvania, to areas near the border with New Jersey today in particular. And of course we'll see a lot of Quakers move into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, of course, is often referred to as the Quaker colony. It was a mission of William Penn's, establishing the colony in the 17th century. And of course, the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania initially was really the symbol for tolerance in the early colonies, as they generally were open to wide arrays of different religious beliefs and so forth, and they tended to treat Native Americans fairly in contrast to other parts of the colonies. But Pennsylvania becomes a location for lots and lots of migrants and immigrants from different parts of the world. The Scotch-Irish, Andrew Jackson, of course, the future president of the United States, was Scotch-Irish and was one of many who migrated to western Pennsylvania. And the Scotch-Irish, by the end of the century, really become well known for their distilling and the making of liquor and spirits near the western borders of Pennsylvania, down the Appalachians. There's others, French immigrants, Dutch immigrants, and of course the Dutch had originally been the ones who colonized New York. Amsterdam, or New Amsterdam, was the original name for what we ultimately call New York City. And of course, this colony was, in 1660, the Duke of York arrived, to Peter Stuyvesant's dismay, in New Amsterdam to seize the Dutch colony there. But of course, there were still a good amount of Dutch immigrants in the colonies. There were also Swedish immigrants. There was a early colony located in the area around Philadelphia known as New Sweden. So it was a country of a diverse migrant population. Of course, also you have increasing numbers of slaves brought across in the triangular trade across the Atlantic. And the colony in the South will increasingly, as we move towards the 19th century, become what we would call a slave society. So there's a difference between a society with slaves and a slave society. And increasingly, the economy of southern states becomes fundamentally reliant and centered on slavery, thereby making it not a society that has slaves, but rather a society that is dominated by slavery, a slave society. One misconception, too, is often that we think that there were no slaves in the Northeast. And in fact, there were slaves in the northern areas at times. They were simply in fewer number. But there were slaves that existed in the northern areas of New England. And in fact, northern states in some cases had a small number of slaves in the lead up to the Civil War in the 19th century even, though their numbers were low, and those areas generally were much more rapid to move towards abolishing slavery, because slavery in the northern areas was not as conducive to the type of geography you had. There wasn't as much in the way of large plantation farming and these types of things. And so you don't find as much slavery, but slavery certainly existed to some degree in areas in the North, in places like New York, for example. When we look at the breakdown of life in the 18th century in terms of the type of work, the nature of medicine, in the origin of early democracy, we find obviously medicine is very antiquated. There were outbreaks of epidemics in cities like Philadelphia. Um, Medical practices were obviously not nearly as advanced as they will even be in the 19th century. Um, and bloodletting was still a common method of medical treatment. Bloodletting was usually they might use leeches, for example, to bleed out. The perspective was you would bleed out the illness, and of course it didn't work, and oftentimes it made the patient even more sick. Economies, the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, and so forth, is really dominated by the growing of tobacco. There's also some wheat that's grown in these areas. The middle colonies, colonies like Pennsylvania particularly, were the breadbasket of the early colonial world in the 18th century, and they were particularly where grains and flour and that type of thing were produced. In New England, which of course began as kind of a real, as in some of the other colonies, New England began as a very fervent religious experiment. But New England, of course, ultimately, by the end of the 17th century, had really become a colony that was attracting a lot of people, no longer for religious reasons, but for economic reasons. And of course, the Salem witch trials was a great example of an incident that occurred in part because of economics, increasing amounts of people coming to Massachusetts that were not there for religious reasons, and what were there for rather economic purposes. And these types of things created tensions within the Salem, Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts colony in general. Massachusetts and New England more generally become associated with whaling and fishing, cod, the right whale, blubber oil from whales were used in numerous things, but particularly whale oil lamps. And the sperm whale was particularly desirable because spermaceti could be used for candles and these types of things. And so whales were very useful commodity, and they were particularly hunted off of the coasts of places like Massachusetts, in New England. You start to see in certain cities, in places like Boston, you see the development of early democracy. And of course, we talked about the House of Burgesses last week, and of course the House of Burgesses is an example of early self-government as well. But we particularly see the development of early democracy and self-government in New England, and institutions, interestingly, like taverns, become a centerpiece in some respect of early democracy. Now, of course, the Boston and the Massachusetts town meetings are an important centerpiece of democracy in the early colonies too. But taverns in places like Boston, which is where you would find the Green Dragon, increasingly in the 18th century become areas in which people meet to discuss important issues and politics and these types of things. And this continues into the 19th century to such an extent that by the middle of the 19th century, historians have sometimes referred to the United States as the alcoholic republic, or something to that effect, because politics and alcohol and taverns intermingled so much. It was a normal behavior for a figure who was interested in local government and affairs to go to the tavern and talk to the folks in the tavern about issues and buy somebody a beer. So we see the development of democracy and self-government not only in institutions like the House of Burgesses, not only in institutions like the Massachusetts Town Meeting, but also in the development of tavern life in places particularly in the Northeast. The Atlantic system We would call this, you see the map here, the map demonstrates the trade patterns, the trade relationship um, between Europe, the New World, the Caribbean, and Africa. And we would refer to this as triangular trade. And together, this entire thing, we would call the Atlantic system, the economic trade system of the Atlantic region. And of course, the triangular trade system is maybe sort of self-explanatory. You had a product that was exchanged. Often you would have a refined product of rum exchanged for slaves. Slaves are then traded for molasses, and the molasses goes into, say, a place in the Atlantic, the mid-Atlantic region, and is then refined into rum, and the process goes around again. The Atlantic system relied on the slave trade. The primary product that was coming from Africa were slaves, and the slaves didn't have to be sold. They didn't have to be sold in like a northern port. They didn't even have to be sold in Charleston, South Carolina. Slaves could often be sold into the Caribbean, where they would be then sold, and you would have or exchanged for, molasses, which of course Caribbean islands like Cuba would become famous for their sugar plantations. And the sugar plantations of South America and the Caribbean required much, much, much more slaves than did the North American plantations in the 18th century, simply because sugar was so labor intensive and it was so devastating on the laborers. People died in droves. There are some myths about slavery and the slave trade. And take a second, I want to see, just take a moment and think for yourself. What are some of the myths that you believe about slavery and the slave trade? Particularly the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is what we're thinking about. The passage from Africa to the Americas. So take a second. Let's see if you get some of the myths. This is a look at a slave ship, and you can see little people crammed into this vessel. Some of the myths about slavery and the slave trade are that because slaves were valuable property, they would be adequately cared for, or that slave traders and slave owners made sure that they, treated healthy male slaves as a valuable commodity and were thereby given acceptable treatment. There's also the myth of the so-called benevolent Southern slave owner who felt it his duty to civilize African slaves in the same sense that an imperialist might have justified colonization with the so-called white man's burden. In reality, this is not accurate. The Middle Passage results in some 15% fatality rate. There are about 2 million people that are brought across on the Middle Passage. And to give you a perspective on how slavery grows in the North American colonies in the United States, at the outset of the American Civil War, there was over 4 million people in slavery. The journey was anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks long, depending on where you were going and what the weather was like. In some cases, there was very blatant brutality on board these ships. There would be cases, in some cases, of purposefully drowning slaves to gain insurance money for lost commodity. And the Zong case is a particular example of the killing of slaves for the purpose of trying to seize insurance, in insurance award. In some cases, if they had to save food or water, they might throw people overboard. If you were sick, they would probably throw you overboard. You could be whipped for being depressed. There's massive disease and depression on these ships. They're filthy and they're awful, and slaves are jammed into the hulls of these vessels. So it's an incredibly brutal process. And the idea that because it was a valuable commodity that they would have been really well watched out for is actually a common myth. This was a brutal institution, and it was a brutal practice. I know that's a lot of notes that just came up there. I want to talk about some of the basic roots of the 7 Years' War and the roots of the American Revolution. Um, in the 18th century, Americans' needs, meaning people in the colonies who, their families maybe were British, but now they live in the colonies and they're American. American needs and English needs begin to clash. And there's increasing attempts in the 18th century by the mother country, Great Britain, England, to control the colonies. And this took a number of forms. In one case, New England, for example, is increasingly regulated by the Crown of England. New England expanded out during the 1600s, and actually expanded out and created its own confederation that included the New Haven, the Puritan New Haven colony, the Bantam-sized Plymouth colony in Massachusetts Bay, and eventually including parts of New Hampshire and even parts of southern Maine. This was seen as an expansion that was not authorized by the crown of Charles II, and it led Charles II in the 1660s to limit the power of the Massachusetts Bay. And he did this in part by expanding the colony of Connecticut, giving them a sea-to-sea charter for the colony that was established by Thomas Hooker, of course, who was the individual who was forced out of the New England colonies. Similarly, Roger Williams's colony that he founded in Rhode Island, another example of a very tolerant colony that was the result of the alienation of individuals in Massachusetts Bay, was also given a charter. And ultimately, the Massachusetts Bay Charter was in fact revoked. Now, during the latter period of the century, of the 17th century, um, England goes through a period of again strife within the country over who should be the rightful king. And King James II would be ousted ultimately, and William of Orange, with his wife Mary, would ultimately take the throne of England and bring about what we know as the Glorious Revolution. And in the Glorious Revolution, you have the establishment in England, with the rise of William of Mary, of really some basic principles when it comes to individual rights and freedom and parliamentary government that influenced the colonies. The English Bill of Rights was particularly related to issues of jurisprudence, fair trials, trials by a jury of peers, and these types of things. And also the Act of Parliamentary Supremacy, in which we see a representative parliament becoming the dominant factor in leading the government of England increasingly. Not entirely, the king still has a lot of power, but these are steps towards the development of representative government and of the uplifting of individual rights that we really see personified in the United States after the American Revolution. And as we lead to the colonies, increasingly in the colonies you see this idea that Americans saw themselves as increasingly as Englishmen and like due English rights to have fair trials and these types of things. But in England, there's an increasing tendency to view people in the Americas as sort of lesser, and for the mother country to use those colonies to make profit for the mother country. So if you look at this map, you get a feel for the areas in which you have the British and the French in the New World. Um, the British and the French and the Spanish created a sort of balance of power in the New World. As the Spanish dominated the Southwest and Florida, the British dominated the Atlantic coastal realm, and the French Empire extended from the port of New Orleans and Louisiana up to Quebec and Canada, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. French colonization began, in the New World, began really about the same time as the English colonization began. Quebec was founded in 1608, though Louis XIV, the great French monarch, very much was able to create unity in France and was able to extend the strength of France both on the continent of Europe but also as an imperial power. The French realm is often referred to by historians as being a sort of middle ground, particularly in areas like the Great Lakes region. And what scholars mean by this is the world in between, the middle ground, the world that's not fully in the European colonial realm, is not fully in the Native American realm, but is in the middle, where natives and Europeans are interacting, and they're intermingling, and they're engaging in compromises, and oftentimes they are engaged in sexual relationships as well. And so it's a sort of middle ground between Native Americans and Europeans, where new notions of being are formed out, in which Native Americans, in some cases, adopt aspects of European Christianity, in which some cases Native Americans engage in relationships with Europeans. And so the middle ground is this place, often in the French Empire and the Great Lakes region, where we see natives and Europeans really coming together in a sort of cultural, oftentimes a sort of cultural sharing. Oftentimes, native goals, and of course you see depicted in this painting here, of course, this is kind of a depiction of the middle ground in which we see, a European colonialist participating in a native, ritual ceremony. So a coming together of the two. Native Americans were very savvy at this point, and Native Americans sought to pursue their goals as best they could, and they sought to create their own autonomy as best they could. And so Native Americans often played European powers off of one another as much as they could, as they try to kind of create a realm of autonomy for themselves in a region that's increasingly being influenced by Europeans. New France is an autocratic colony. We don't see a lot of the kind of local small government type of self-government stuff that you see in the English colonies. It grows slowly. There's not a whole lot of like towns or cities that you find, small cities of course, that you find in the British colonies on the coast. It's really more of a trapping empire. The thing that really made the economy of New France function as a whole, and this is kind of with the exception of New Orleans, but the thing that really made it function was trapping, particularly for the beaver pelt, which was a highly desired and sought after commodity that in Europe was the fur of the beaver. And so that was the real industry of New France, which was a rather loosely connected and far-flung imperial domain. Of course, also Jesuit missionaries, the famous Catholic missionaries, moved throughout the western areas and the central areas of the United States, from the Mississippi to the Great Lakes region, to as far as areas of near Montana in the Northwest today, promoting Catholicism to native peoples. The most kind of bustling and populous and active area of New France is New Orleans in Louisiana. And New Orleans was a major port, and it was an area where you saw a great deal of different types of people and different types of cultural behaviors coming together. The 1700s represented really a century of war. There's a series of wars during the 1700s, really beginning with Queen Anne's War. Queen Anne's War, Queen Anne is pictured here. She is the monarch before George. Queen Anne was the monarch during the Queen Anne's War, and this was a war that lasted some 11 years, and it took the form in many cases of guerrilla war with Native Americans. It also you also saw raids by colonists into Florida and into Georgia and into Canada as the English are increasingly coming into conflict with natives and with the French and the Spanish. At the end of Queen Anne's War, the Peace of Utrecht was signed between the two, and it was a great defeat in many respects for the French. And this is the first of a series of losses for the French in which the British slowly increasingly seize the territory of their imperial competitors within North America. After the Peace of Utrecht, Britain received Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, areas around the Hudson Bay. They also gained trading rights with New Spain. And there was devastation wrought on Florida Native Americans in these conflicts. Later in the century, we have very interesting little conflicts like the War of Jenkins' Ear, in which the Spanish and the British briefly fought a conflict that was fought in the Caribbean as well as in Georgia, that was instigated by a Spanish ship basically alleging the English of smuggling effectively, and having one of the English captains have his ear cut off as kind of a warning to the English crown. And during the War of Jenkins' Ear, you have conflicts in Cuba and the Caribbean, all the way down to Venezuela and Panama, which of course were parts of the Spanish Empire in the region. And this is important. This is when James Oglethorpe leads the first colonists that were formed to fight militarily for the crown and beyond the colonies. The 7 Years' War is very much, I'm going to go ahead and put all this stuff up for you guys. The 7 Years' War is a precursor to the American Revolution. In the colonies, now first it's important to remember, we're going to look at the American side of this, but the 7 Years' War is actually a European conflict as well. And there's different theater of war in Europe, in which countries like the Austrians and the Prussians and the French were fighting. And one of the big mistakes that was made by the French, that was not made by the British, was that the French focused too much on the European theater of affairs, whereas the British tended to allow their allies, the Prussians, to fight the war in Europe while they funded it, but the British sought to instead focus on their imperial domains internationally. And that really proved out to be for the benefit of the British, who will win the 7 Years' War, and in the process will seize pretty much all of the French territory in the New World. In North America, the 7 Years' War began really on the basis of claims by Virginia families like George Washington's family, to as much as 500,000 acres of land located in the Ohio River area. And this was an area where the French had begun to extend out their own fur trading empire, and the French had established forts at Cincinnati, and of course most easterly at Fort Duquesne, which was located close to modern-day Pittsburgh. The first volleys of this war actually happened in 1754, when the governor of Virginia allowed Lieutenant Colonel George Washington to take 150 men up in through West Virginia, or what will be West Virginia, western Virginia, into the area of dispute near modern-day Pittsburgh at Fort Duquesne, to effectively demand that the French give up this area and give in to English claims. And of course, Washington was routed, and he was pursued by the French and their Native American ally. And ultimately, Washington had been encircled and surrounded, at which point he and his soldiers built a makeshift fort called Fort Necessity on July 4th, 1754. Fort Necessity was built because they were under siege, and they had to build this, and the fort was the way that you defended yourself at this time of colonial warfare. Ultimately, they're captured, and they're released, and Washington's allowed to go home with kind of the warning, don't come back. Ultimately, after this happens, you see the development of a widespread conflict. There's conflicts in the Philippines, in the West Indies, in Africa, in Europe, and of course in North America. The British really succeed by focusing on the North American side, and their victory, the victory for the British really comes in a famous battle, the Battle of Quebec, that happens on the Plains of Abraham, in which both the British general Wolfe and the French general Montcalm both die, but the British secure one of the most impressive victories in the history of the British Empire, and in the process of this are ultimately able to seize effectively all of French territory in the New World. Another important step, and this is important for reasons of the American Revolution during the 7 Years' War, was during the summer of 1754, as we saw the first hostilities breaking out between the French and the American colonists. Benjamin Franklin famously, Benjamin Franklin, who was the great American, he was involved in newspapers and printing, and he was an ad hoc early scientist, and he lived in Philadelphia, and he helped to improve Philadelphia on a number of levels. Benjamin Franklin famously published a cartoon, which is this chopped up snake that you see here, and in each section of the snake represented a part of the colonies, New England, New York, and so forth. And he called this Congress and used this this cartoon at the Congress to try to insist that the colonialists unite. He promoted colonial home rule and unity. Unfortunately, only seven of the 13 colonies would attend. And the Crown's perspective on Benjamin Franklin's plan is that it provided too much home rule, too much independence. And the colonists' general gripe on Franklin's strategy was that it didn't provide enough home rule. But nonetheless, this was a model for the future. It was the first step towards the Albany Congress was the first step towards creating a unity amongst the colonists. And you will start to see further steps made with the Stamp Act Congress after the 7 Years' War, as members of as colonists band together to boycott the Stamp Act passed by the British, and also, of course, the Continental Congress, both the First and Second Continental Congress, in the lead up to the American Revolution, as we start to see the colonists begin to band together to form not governments, but bodies that can promote the demands of colonists in a more unified way. So it was a very important development for the development of American identity and of some kind of unified American action on the part of colonists. British victory in the 7 Years' War comes when William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister, he becomes known as the Organizer of Victory, transforms the strategy of the British by focusing not on small outposts but on the strongholds, on the main arteries of the French Empire in the Americas. And this leads to crushing victories at Louisburg in 1758, and the main victory came on the Plains of Abraham outside of Quebec City, in which General James Wolfe wins a crushing victory over his French counterpart. The victory in Quebec results in, at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, results in France being pushed completely off the continent. And the image you see down here is the general who was mortally wounded, surrounded by his troops at the Battle of Quebec. And while he's killed, as is the French general, both are killed. But it's a huge victory for the British, and the British get basically all of the French possessions in the Americas. This is William Pitt, the organizer of victory. This is an important moment, of course, because Great Britain is becoming the dominant world power. They're the dominant power in North America and then the dominant power at sea. So here we have a closer look, and you see Louisburg towards the top of your map. That was an important victory in 1758 because it helped to control access to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is this waterway that comes down past Quebec and Montreal into the Great Lakes. That was really the key to the artery for the French controlling New France, their colonial territories. This is a look at just how global this war was. The map is demonstrating for you where the combatant powers are. British and the Prussians in Europe, the British in the Americas, the French and the Spanish in the Americas, British influence in Africa, the British in India, the French in India, Spanish in the Philippines, and so forth. So it was really a war of global powers. The consequence of the 7 Years' War, despite it being this great victory for the British, is actually trouble in the colonies. Now, one might immediately look at this and say, how can this be? How can you have this tremendous victory in which you see here everything basically east of the Mississippi was to the right of the British Empire? So how could this be? How could you have such an expansion of authority and yet have problems in the colonies? Wouldn't the colonies be thriving like never before? In a way, the British have kind of like victory syndrome. They feel more empowered than ever before. And in addition to this, they're kind of angry at the colonists. Because the colonists, in their perspective, one of the reasons that the war happened was because of colonists who were continually moving west and were fighting with the French and were fighting with Native Americans. And so the British increasingly, after the 7 Years' War, began to sort of look down on the colonists. The colonists see themselves as colonial subjects, as British subjects, and the English see them more as colonial subjects, not fully worthy of all the rights of Englishmen. And so this is going to create some real tensions between the colonists and the crown. And of course, this also led to the demotion of all colonists who served in the armed services to nothing higher than the rank of captain. So George Washington was actually demoted after the war. There's also an irony of the war. The British have a huge territorial expansion, but the war also results in massive debt. And from their perspective, it was North America and the conflict in North America that was the cause of this debt. And their answer for this is to simply make the colonies profitable. And so as a result of this, the British are going to increasingly try to find ways to regulate the colonists. They will prevent the colonists or try to prevent the colonists from moving west and fighting with Native Americans. They will draw, as you see on the map here, they will effectively etch out the proclamation line of 1863 and demand that no colonists cross over the Appalachians. They will place various taxes and duties on the colonists and insist that they pay them. Okay? And they insist on making the colonies profitable. They've had debt as a result of this. They deem it to be the colonists' fault, and they're going to use policies to make sure that the colonists pay their share. In addition, they'll begin to house British troops in the colonies under the basis of protecting the colonists. But it was also because the British don't want to have to move soldiers every time there's a conflict between colonists and Native Americans. Another irony is that while the English are looking down on colonists, from the colonialist perspective, they were never more British. They fought alongside British commanders for a great British imperial cause. For them, they've never been more British. But they're going to increasingly find that they have an increasing difficulty to be profitable in this new, more regulated colonial system. American colonists were increasingly smuggling for profit. One of the great smugglers of his age was John Hancock. And that's why when somebody says, "Give me your John Hancock," and that refers to that large signature, Hancock was famous for having the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence. Well, that was largely because John Hancock had a vested interest in signing that declaration, because Hancock had been making all of his money as a smuggler in the shipping industry. So colonists were smuggling to make profit. They smuggled food into the West Indies during the war, and they smuggled a number of other types of products in order to try to get around English duties that were being placed on these products. We also see, and this is sort of similar to what you remember with Bacon's Rebellion, we see continual conflict with Native Americans. In 1763, Chief Pontiac, the native leader, attacked American settlements, and there were lots of people killed. In response to this, a group of colonists led by groups like the Paxton Boys sought to open up native lands, and they went to great lengths to attack native settlements. They used rudimentary biological warfare by distributing, we believe, blankets that have been used with patients of smallpox. And ultimately, this devastates the native peoples. And you really see this be the moment. This is in western Pennsylvania. And you see this at a moment where we see the Pennsylvania experiment of William Penn, the noble experiment, which, the people in Pennsylvania had often treated Native Americans with an unprecedented fairness. And this new conflict between Native Americans of Chief Pontiac and groups like the Paxton Boys really ends any kind of mutual collaboration that might have, in fairness, that might have existed there or in the future. The British will then, of course, as I mentioned, station troops permanently in the colonies, and this will begin, obviously, to increase tensions, especially as we move into the 1770s. The British passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, demanding that no colonists should move west across the Appalachian Mountains because they're concerned with tension and conflict, which, from their perspective, has cost them a lot of money. Of course, what's the big problem with that? The big problem with that is, from Americans' perspective, from people like George Washington's perspective, just for example, the lands across the Appalachians were actually probably the biggest reason why they fought the 7 Years' War. Colonial tensions increase through these various measures. And of course, many of you maybe know the name Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote, his famous Wealth of Nations in 1776. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was a refutation of mercantilism. Adam Smith promoted the idea of small-level private capitalism, and it was kind of an attack on the mercantilist system. During this period of time, in the 18th century, the dominant mode of colonial economics was what's called the mercantilist system. And effectively what that meant is that all colonies, all colonial economics were designed to benefit the mother country. So the goal was to produce profit for the mother country. And the colonial power, the mother country, used whatever measure it needed to use to make its colonies profitable. So there was a disconnect between the desire of colonists to be profitable and for the mother country to be profitable. This leads to, in the colonies, a currency crisis. Colonists are continually forced to buy more than they sold, hence, making them more profitable. They're continually having to buy more than they're able to sell. Manufacturing is discouraged in the colonies. Resources are designed to go to the mother country where things are manufactured, and then colonists are intended to buy the manufactured product to the mother country. In addition, the Navigation Acts, which go back to the 1650s and were some of the tensions that things like Bacon's Rebellion resulted in, the Navigation Acts, which had been largely avoided. I mean, like I said, John Hancock was a smuggler, and these had largely been ignored. But the Navigation Acts in the 1760s are going to be enforced, and that means all traded items had to go through an English customs house or an English customs officer first. They had to be taxed through England before they could be sold anywhere else. Prime Minister Grenville, who is in the painting below, is overseeing the acts of making this colony profitable, and this included placing things like a sugar tax or the Sugar Act. It involved the Quartering Act, the first Quartering Act, which was basically a tax to quarter troops in the colonies, and the Stamp Act, which of course is the most notorious of these. And the image above Grenville is an example of opposition to the hated stamp tax. The Stamp Act was basically an act that deemed that items, paper items and so forth, letters and so forth, had to be stamped. You had to pay a tax on it, basically. You had to pay a postage tax, if you will. And if you violated this, you could be tried violated these types of acts, you could be tried in an admiralty court. And that's another, again, think about the relationship now between colonists and the crown. Colonists very much see themselves as Englishmen, worthy of the rights of Englishmen, whereas the crown increasingly sees the colonists as colonists, not worthy of the full rights of Englishmen. And so from the colonist perspective, to try them in an admiralty court, it's basically like being court-martialed. The English Bill of Rights had given mandates to fair trials, to proper jurisprudence. But yet if you violate the Stamp Act and you don't pay the stamp tax, then you could be tried in what was seen as an unfair act, an act that did not protect your rights in jurisprudence as an Englishman. So, following the emplacing of the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, these types of programs, colonists begin to grow in outrage to the policies of the crown. And of course we start to see the kind of cliche phrase, no taxation without representation, becoming something that the colonists will appeal to. Even though it's a bit of a cliche, individuals in England actually paid more taxes than colonists did. However, this, is sort of relative because colonialists want to be successful, they want to be profitable, and the Crown's mercantilist policy is making it increasingly difficult for them to be profitable. Likewise, increasingly, colonialists see themselves in the empire as Englishmen, deserving of the rights of English citizens. And the results of the Glorious Revolution were to grant basic rights to Englishmen when it came to justice and jurisprudence. And it also created a basic parliamentary system. I mean, the parliamentary system was long in place, but the act of parliamentary supremacy meant that when it came to issues of taxation, a representative parliamentary body, a body in which people within the realm were represented, would have the ultimate voice on these matters. These were highly significant, and the colonists see themselves as unrepresented. The colonists see themselves as being taxed without actually having a voice or a say in them. And from their standpoint, seeing themselves as Englishmen, they see these as a fundamental violation of their views. And of course, the Crown, as you recall from the earlier slide, the Crown very much sees them as imperial subjects who need to make profit for the mother country, and they're not Englishmen with full rights of English citizens. Individuals like Sam Adams encourage the Stamp Act Congress, which the Stamp Act Congress, like a further movement towards unity in the colony, not unlike the Albany Congress or the Continental Congress. The Stamp Act Congress is called to create unity amongst the colonists in opposing these measures of taxation placed by the Crown. The Stamp Act Congress begins to boycott English goods. And groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty come out of groups known as Committees on Correspondence, who are basically political committees that join together to negotiate their strategy for dealing with these oppressive policies. The Sons and Daughters of Liberties were secret societies. And the Sons of Liberties, for example, oftentimes used violence against customs collectors. They might go to the customs collector's house at night and drag him outside, beat him up, and tar and feather him. This creates a lot of animosity from the Crown of England, of course. But who else do you think doesn't want these policies placed in the colonies? It's actually kind of an unlikely one, but it makes sense. English merchants. English merchants are very upset about these various acts of taxation because the colonists are boycotting their manufactured goods. And as a result of that, they can't make the same amount of profit. They place pressure on the Crown, and they demand that the Crown repeal the Stamp Act. And the Crown grudgingly accepts. When the Crown accepts, though, the Crown responds and passes something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act was basically the Crown saying, okay, we'll repeal that act, but we reserve the right to tax our colonies when and how we want to at any time. And in 1767, they passed the Townshend Acts, and the Townshend Act placed duties on certain more exotic items like white lead, for example, which was used in the making of glass. And the Townshend duties encourage individuals in these industries to increasingly smuggle. And some individuals are economically hurt quite substantially. Paul Revere actually had to continually find different lines of work because of the manner in which these types of duties affected him. Sam Adams, who's pictured here, becomes one of the foremost proponents that colonists should oppose the Townshend Acts, that they should smuggle if they need to. And simultaneously, as the atmosphere becomes increasingly intense and somewhat hostile, you see increasing stationing of troops in the colonies. And this will culminate in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. So if you take a second and look at this, if you look at this flyer, this is the Boston Massacre. What does this tell you? What's going on here? This is an example, and this is distributed by Paul Revere, and this is an example of early propaganda, basically. The Boston Massacre is projected as an organized massacre of innocent colonists, in which the mighty redcoats organized in a row and at order fired into the colonists. In reality, it was a melee. It was brought on by colonists who were cursing and throwing rocks and ice balls and frustrated troops. And we're not even 100% certain exactly who fired the first shot. But it seems pretty apparent there was no direct order. But the way it's distributed throughout the colonies to individuals in the colonies is very significant. because the colonists will view it as direct act of British aggression, the hostility of redcoats in the colonies. And so the Boston Massacre, flyers like this, pamphlets, or I should say newspaper depictions like this, were used as a way to stir up the emotional sentiment of colonialists as there became increasing resistance between the Crown and the colonists. Following the Boston Massacre, of course, the most significant event that leads up to the American Revolution was the Boston Tea Party, which occurs on December 16th, 1773. And of course, the Boston Tea Party was the result of effectively an attempt by the British to make one of their best corporations profitable, and that was the East India Company. The East India Company had an incredible hold full of tea that it needed to unload somewhere, and the British Crown thought, well, hey, the colonists all drink tea, so we'll give a monopoly to the East India Company on tea sales in Massachusetts and in the colonies as a whole. And the colonists will be happy because they'll get tea, there'll be lots of tea, and they'll be happy, and the East India Company will be happy because they'll have somewhere to sell their product. Well, of course, the colonists, who are kind of on a very stiff position right now, the colonists see this as more of the Crown trying to dictate to them who they should buy their product from and how they should spend their money, and also granting them sort of a level of control over colonial trade that colonists were not comfortable with. And so, of course, the result of this, in other ports, the ships were turned away. In the ports in Baltimore, other ports, ships were turned away. In Boston, the governor at the time, Thomas Hutchinson, insisted that the tea be unloaded and sold. Insisted that they participate and cooperate with the East India Company. And of course, what happens, as we know, is a group of colonists, dressed up and perhaps a little drunken, board the ships and they dump the tea into the harbor. And this act really brought the ire from King George and the Prime Minister of England, as from their perspective, this was an unchecked and unbrought on aggression against a private corporation, and it was the destruction of private property. And the result of this was the passage of the Intolerable Acts. They were known as the Coercive Acts in England, and they were referred to as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies. These acts were just incredibly controversial for colonists because, in one respect, the British Crown is trying to punish the colonists. But these acts, from the perspective of the colonists, are incredibly harsh. In one respect, the port of Boston is closed until the people of Massachusetts pay back the lost money to the East India Company. The port would remain closed indefinitely. There was a more intense variation of the Quartering Act that was put into place. More troops will come to the colonies, and the colonists will have to house them, and the colonists will have to open their houses up to the availability to these troops, whether they choose to or not. There are restrictions placed on town meetings in Massachusetts, and of course, the town meeting in Massachusetts was particularly a pride of people in this area as a centerpiece of their democracy, of their representative government, I should say. And then probably the one that was maybe the biggest slap in the face to many colonists was the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act turned around and gave all of the land claims to the West that were possessed by colonists in the British colonies to Canada, to effectively, as they would have seen them, to French Canadians who were part of the British Empire. So they're not giving it away to another country, but the areas of Quebec and Canada, the British colonists in the American colonies in North America had fought the 7 Years' War over claims to those lands. And now the crown turned around and effectively said, you're not worthy of those lands. You have misbehaved to such a degree that we are going to give your territory, your claimed territory, away, and you no longer have a right to it. You will be controlled by the crown, and you will behave. And so this is where the colonies come to on the eve of the Revolution. And one can really get a feel for how this tension has escalated as the mother country tries to increasingly control her colonies, and as the colonists increasingly define themselves as an extension of Great Britain, who have a right to representation, who have rights like Englishmen, and who have a right to be, or attempt to be, profitable. After the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, were passed, the colonists formed the First Continental Congress in 1774. And we're a long way off from declaring independence. But the first thing they do is they declare their rights as Englishmen. And they form a total boycott of English goods, known as the Association.